Welcome. I'm Fanny van der Poel. I'm a social counselor at the Student Affairs Service, and we are very, very glad to welcome you today for this conference on stress and anxiety on cognitive and social functioning from a neuroscientific and behavioral perspective. We are very, very glad also to welcome Professor Carmen Sandy, who is a world leader in the field of neuroscience and mental health that connects stress with brain and function behavior. Her work in this field brought meaningful contribution to the understanding of the mechanism whereby stress affects cognition, aggression, and psychopathologies. She's a professor at EPFL and leads the Laboratory of Behavioral Genetics. She's co-director of the National Center of Competence in Research, Synapse, which focuses on research in the field of mental health. She's the founder and co-president of the Stress Network, and her work has been published in over 250 articles and various books. She has been awarded many prizes for her outstanding work, among which the Ron de Clotte Prize and the ISRA John Scott Award. Please welcome warmly Professor Carmen Sandy.
So it's a pleasure to be here sharing with you the work that we've been doing in my lab over the last decades, but also reflections that come from maybe personally looking at the data and also personal experiences. And I hope that we can have also this personal dialogue towards the end. But anyhow, listening or hearing from you what type of stressors and situations are important for you is going to be critical. So start thinking about the topics that we are going to discuss in the second part of the talk. Okay, one has to be plastic not to get too stressed with technical details. Let's start. It doesn't work. So yeah, it doesn't work. We've been preparing. Don't think that it's lack of preparation. It works. Okay, so the topic today that I want to discuss is how stress affects our social domain, our social self, and also cognitive function. And we are going to do it through a neuroscientific and also behavioral perspective. And I think stress is becoming even more popular than it used to be. In the scientific magazines, there is every week almost. It used to be every year an article regarding the stress in academia, but now it's more and more. This is one that came up in the last few weeks. It's a survey to many graduate students, including PhD students and masters, and asking them if they are stressed, and the levels are very high, and also identifying the type of stressors, what situations make them stressed. And I don't know, because I see many students here, so I wonder if you see yourselves reflected here. But for example, difficulty maintaining the work-life balance, also the financial worries. Maybe we are luckier in Switzerland in this way, but also the future. It's a problem, uncertainty about the future. And also, as you can see in the other type of experiments or studies, is failed experiments or negative feedback from supervisors, and also social isolation. I think these are situations that resonate from the last years that we've been experiencing a lot, the social isolation, social changes, etc. Also, the work in the academic environments is by itself stressful because there are a lot of pressures, and it seems that there is now a focus very important in looking at how we manage science and academia in institutions. Is it healthy? Is it good? Because of course it's a very competitive world. So stress maybe it's natural in this environment. To what extent we have to bear it and stand it, or we have to revise what we are doing? I think it's good to hear from others how people are feeling, because there is a lot of consequences, both for physical and mental health. And here we are at the EPFL. We've been seeing articles about how other people all over the world feels regarding stress in academia. Here I try to figure out ourselves what are maybe our stressors And perhaps we have the EPFL in the center, and then the rest of our life and world around. So of course there are different stressors that can affect us, like academic performance or promotion concerns, the increased burden of administration that it's very stressful, failed experiments, budget cuts, space constraints, issues with colleagues. It can be with superior, with colleagues, with many different type of persons, competition, workload, deadlines, lack of time, reduced personal finances, perhaps crowded environments, and then all this is surrounded now in an increasingly stressful world. I think this is of concern. Even those that manage maybe not to be too stressed and have a balanced life now cannot escape from maybe all these other worries that are coming from around the world and around ourselves. How to cope with this? And I think this is a bit what I want to discuss, not only how to cope, but why it's an issue and what's happening, how is it working. So these are stressors, and when we talk about stress, we have many times the problem of the definition. How do we define stress? Is this stress? These are stressors, these are situations, and the reality is that not everyone is equally affected by them. So when we try to think about stress, we have to think that there are situations that are maybe challenges, but there are also the individuals, and we are very different. We are going to talk a little bit about these individual differences a bit towards the end of my talk, but I think they are critical for many different reasons, because heat, for example, that was one stressor that I remarked there, it's physical, so it's going to affect us. It doesn't matter so much, maybe it depends on how we process the heat that we feel in a way or the other one, but it's physical and it's stress in our body. But many of the other stressors, they are more from the psychosocial world, and it's going to be very important how we process. So when we talk about the stress, we have different elements that are critical. One is the situation, and the other one is the individual, how the individual appraises the situation. And also, of course, how the individual has the biology, because we are not equal, but that's something we will talk about later. And then, what for if we have a stress? Does it make sense? And I like to give this example because I think it makes it very clear why we have a stress. We have a stress because it's been a very effective psychophysiological reaction that has helped all our ancestors to survive across challenges. So there have been a lot of challenges throughout history, evolution, in which thanks to the capacity of activating stress response, like for example, there is a fire, this Bambi is running, this person is running, otherwise it might be cut. Those individuals that throughout this evolutionary scale didn't manage to mount this physiological stress response that we are going to describe in a second, they had much higher chances to die because they were not capable of avoiding the stressors. They were just perhaps not bothered. What's the matter? And then we are the result of all the other survivors. And that's why we have a physiological response that is very alarming somehow. There is a threat, and then we have this bumping of the heart and the sweating and many other differences in responses that we are going to see how they are produced. So indeed, we, along with many other animals throughout evolution, react with this type of physiological activations when we are exposed to stressors. We don't need to have the fire or a lion following us as our ancestors. Now, whenever we feel a threat, many times we are just reproducing what we have inherited. And this is, in physiological responses, there are two master systems in the external physiology, which are the sympathetic nervous system, is one of the branches of the autonomic nervous system, is the one that is going to really activate the adrenaline and all these other organs that are helping us coping with the threat, like pumping the blood so that the oxygen can go all over to our muscles, so that if there is indeed a lion that's following us, we can run. If the fire is there, we can run. And it's doing that because of all these mechanisms, and in addition because something that these hormones, adrenaline, and also we are going to see the other physiological system, the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Both systems, eventually, one of the fastest responses, physiological ones that they have, is to increase the levels of glucose. So they activate glucose, and glucose is what we need to run. So that's what's happening when we are stressed. We are activating these two systems. The second one is a neuroendocrine system. It relies on hormonal messages, and it's slightly slower, so they are complementary. This adrenaline and the heart beating comes very fast as soon as we are detecting something. And then the hormonal system comes slower so that it can complement the actions, so that it can help us keep going if the lion is still there and we have to keep running. So all these systems are very, very useful. And of course, they have been selected throughout evolution because they are helping us activating all this physiology. I have to say, and I have to go back, that I've been talking a lot about muscles and glucose, but the brain is there. The brain is perceiving the information, and it's sending the signals to the hypothalamus to activate these two systems. So how we perceive things is coded by brain systems, and this is funneled through the activation of the hypothalamus to activate these two systems. So how we perceive things is going to be very, very important. And also, we have now the communication between brain and periphery. So the brain activates the periphery and governs all these actions so that we have many different, I don't have the time to go through all these physiological responses, but it's fascinating. Many, many, many things are changing. We will see a little bit of the consequences afterwards. And vice versa, the periphery is capable of cross-talking back to the brain and affect how we are seeing things. So this is very interesting because in stress, we change the way we perceive the reality, and we have to take decisions also. So all these systems are talking to the brain to change the way we are behaving. So when the stress is acute, we all heard about this 3F. The freeze is very specific, and I don't have time to go into it. I think the most typical ones are the fight or flight. Flight or fight. We heard it many times. And this is exactly, we have glucose, and that's what we need to escape, as we saw before, to flight, or to fight. Because indeed, many times the stress comes from competition, for example, for resources in nature. And that's maybe one way we have to think about it. Stress is there to help us solving these situations. If it was useful in the past and we inherited, is it useful nowadays? Because nowadays people don't want to be stressed, but we are stressed, in fact. No way we can say, I'm not going to get stressed, because these systems have been so useful. They made us surviving over centuries, millions of years, so we are not going to escape of that. We are hardwired to react like that, and they are very useful, these responses, in many situations, still nowadays. But what happens when we are doing an interview or an oral exam or many other things, or having to have a difficult situation with a colleague or a family member, and we are so stressed? Is this a mismatch, or is this useful for something? I think the way I see everything is that we need to understand physiology, where things come from. I'm not going to come with particular solutions, but to understand ourselves already help us a lot. And I think it can help us also developing some interventions. So when we talk about stress, what is more important is what happens right now, because it's a response to survive. But the reality is that sometimes the stress or the situation doesn't go immediately. So it's not that we are only acutely stressed, that we are chronically stressed because the situation continues there. And this is slightly complicated from a physiological point of view, because biology puts so many resources in having a very strong physiological reaction to survive that it doesn't care about the future. It cares about the current moment. And it uses a lot of resources. So it can be very good, as we are going to see, but on the long term, it can bring tear and wear to our systems, biological systems, to our brain, and it can be problematic. So we are going to talk about these chronic actions. And something also very interesting is that we also know that it's not only at the moment that you can have changes in your physiology or your brain, it's also that you can program your future yourself, so that stress and the stress mediators can have also programming effects, for example, by changing the wiring of the brain during development, or epigenetic changes, for example. So if we go back to this fight-flight, and we want to discuss about whether stress has an impact in our social behavior, maybe you would say, but it's obvious, stress is there to fight somehow. But is it true? This is the text, book text definition. Is it true that when we are stressed, we can have maybe changes in our behaviors, in our social behaviors? This is something that we started asking around 10 years back in the lab, because of some serendipitous findings that we had. And then we did experiments in rodents, look at the literature in monkeys, and also the epidemiologic literature in humans, also clinical literature in humans. And we could really get enough evidence that indeed under acute stress, a natural reaction when people are confronted with other conspecifics is to be more aggressive. So maybe we have personal experience on this, to be more aggressive. Still, we wanted to do experiments in the lab, and we used behavioral economics to try to understand more why would that be. No, because one thing is to really have to fight, and maybe you are more aggressive, but in our normal life, would this work? And then using economic games, we could conclude that those individuals that were doing the games under stressful conditions, they took more risk, like sometimes we are more risk-taking when we are under stress or whatever, but particularly what we saw is that control individuals that were not stressed, they took into account the consequences for a second individual. They tried not to harm another one, and those under stress, they didn't care so much. And one would say, oh, they are mean, but in reality, if we think what it's a stress response, which is a response to help us surviving when there is a danger, it's normal that under stress, we are self-focused. Maybe we don't notice so much what's going on with other individuals. We forget them a bit. So I think it's important to be aware of all these changes that could be happening, because it can help us if we want to gather and manage our stress. So from a huge literature, and I forgot to say at the beginning, I'm saying very general statements to make it clearer and simpler. Of course, this is very complex, but indeed, stress makes us maybe more aggressive. But people would say and argue, maybe that's not so much true, because we know other literature in which, particularly in females and in women, stress induces a more kind of a tend and befriend reaction. Like maybe people tend to group themselves, to be more into the in-group. And there is a lot of literature that supports this, particularly, for example, in rodents, the female dams that have the babies, then they try to keep the colony together, etc., when there is a stress. So it's more bonding, if you want. But then there is also this more attacking the outside world. And it's something that we can see also in groups of people. When there is maybe wars or there is conflict, maybe indeed there is this tend and befriend among groups, but it results many times on being more against the others. Many times we have complex type of mechanisms. So I think I wanted to bring it also, because now also I think with the COVID, the lockdowns, etc., there were a lot of effects of stress in our social behaviors, and it's worth being aware of this type of effects. So I've been talking more maybe about acute. How about chronic? So in humans, we cannot do chronic stress experiments, but we can look at humans that are chronically stressed, like, for example, depressed people. Chronic stress is a very excellent model to induce depression, so be careful, don't get into chronic stress. And those individuals that develop a post-traumatic stress disorder, also they are exposed to chronic stress. And in both cases, also human work indicates as well that chronic stress tends to lead to more increased aggressive behaviors and also social retraction or withdrawal avoidance. So to conclude a bit, I think stress for many individuals can lead to this social withdrawal and also more increased antisocial behaviors. A little bit. I have to say there are individual differences, but this is on average. And this is fine, but something that perhaps we want to explain as well is more aberrant types of aggressive behavior, like violence. And this is mainly the ones that are committed to individuals that are not a threat for anybody, like, for example, children or women in cases of domestic violence, or, for example, other attacks in the community, which are massive and not targeted. And would stress also affect this type of behaviors? And what a huge literature that has been growing over the years tell us is that particularly when stress and trauma happens during early development, which is the time when the brain is developing and many of the important brain regions to manage with behaviors and also social behavior decision-making are developing, then having stress during this period can be particularly detrimental for long-term effects. And this is quite well known in the literature, also in the epidemiology, that those children that are exposed to neglect, abuse very early in life have a higher probability to develop aberrant types of behavior later in life. Probability, and not everyone, again. So wrapping up from what I told you now, and also maybe being a bit more inclusive, that it's not only this domain that gets affected, being exposed to stressors, high stressors during development, also chronic stress during life, can lead to different psychopathologies, so it's not good to be exposed to too much stress if possible. Also, we have here depression, anxiety, and also memory and attention deficits. And that, because of time running, brings me now to talk about the effects of stress in cognition. Here, maybe I take a breath now so that you can consolidate what I just mentioned regarding the social domain. So we are going to now ask if stress is affecting cognition. And maybe you are already thinking, oh my God, stress is terrible. It's such a negative state. This is one way that we normally depict stress as something that's negative for our cognitive capacities. But I'm going to argue that stress has a positive side, and it can be wonderful for our performance. And I think maybe you'll experience it yourselves. But it's a very effective motivator. I give you maybe my personal incursion into these ideas, and that was many years ago. My first postdoc, I had to study the mechanisms of memory, and we were trying to understand the molecules that made memories long-term, like consolidating. And when I was training these little chicks to remember that what they were pecking was aversive, what I realized is that they had a very strong stressful response. They were very scared. They pecked something, it was aversive, and then they were very scared. And what we did experiments to ask if stress could be really affecting this strength of memory consolidation, and that was the case. So that was a first evidence. The second one was in mammals, in rodents. We were training animals on spatial memory, and they had to find a platform that's hidden, and the water, I mean, they have to develop like a spatial map, and the water can be modulated in different temperatures. So what we saw is that the higher the temperature, the less stressful, the worse the animals learned. By playing with the water temperature that made it more stressful, it helped the animals bring in meaning, if you want, and remembering later. And then we could show that stress hormones in the post-training period were good for this consolidation. But is it true? Because if I ask you now and I say, oh, it's so much better to have stress to perform in science or academia, is it true? Then I've been asking this now for some time because I was surprised once in the lab that I asked this, and some people said, no way, this is not good for me. I really prefer not to have stress. So we did an experiment also in animals in which now we use different more degrees of temperature, and what we could reproduce is something that maybe you've heard many times, but it had not been published under the same circumstances and paradigm is that depending on the degree of stress, we can get to a level that it's optimal, but if it's higher, then it's detrimental. This inverted U shape, too little stress, too much stress is not good. There is an intermediate level. It's easy to say, but tricky to know which is our intermediate level and the optimal. But this is, I think, quite relevant. What was more interesting for us is that we had characterized the animals for different personality traits, and then we could look if all the animals follow the same inverted U shape. And what we saw is that some animals are much better when there is very little stress, and other animals are much better when there is more stress. So it seems that we have different set points for how we perceive stress or we react to stress, and we also perform cognitively under stress. So I didn't know that once many years ago when I had a PhD student in the lab that was maybe a bit lost at that time, and I thought, I'm going to put a bit of pressure because I think it's very good to perform better. So I asked him to come every day with a new figure because he didn't manage to organize his data. And then he told me one day, it was so great that you put this pressure to me. It really saved me, and it brought clarity. It was wonderful. So next time I had another PhD student with problems, I did the same, and he got blocked. It was a very bad experience for him and for me. And this, I think, it showed that indeed we have different set points, and we have to understand the individuals we are dealing with, but also ourselves. In the lab, also in collaboration with colleagues at the Brain Mind Institute, with Wolfram Gerstner's laboratory, we did physiological behavioral experiments and also computational models, in which we came up with this model, which I think explains a lot of the inverted U shape for cognition. So here, if we have arousal or stress, when it's too little, then we have this exploration factor that it goes towards exploration. So we are very exploratory. When I have to write a project and the deadline is very far, I start searching in PubMed. I just enjoy a lot. I search for a lot of things. I'm not very effective, in fact, in the progress. As soon as the stress comes higher because the deadline comes there, then I have to be careful because maybe it's tomorrow, the deadline. So I have to be very exploitative, which is what you have with time. But then there is another factor, which is impulsivity. And then you might not be able to manage things very well because you don't have the capacity to really integrate everything very well. So what we also realized is that different individuals, we did experiments with mice, but you can apply this to humans, have indeed different physiological reactions and different set points. So what I think we need to understand is where we are so that we know that perhaps it's not good that we leave everything until the end if we are somebody that gets blocked. If we are somebody that can manage more stress, because at that point you are in the optimal, then that's what you have to do. But somehow there is no magic formula that I can give you. So I think we have like 10 more minutes, and I'm going to complete a little bit this part on memory, because I've been saying that some stress can be good at the time of learning if it's bound to meaning, because that brings to wherever we are learning meaning, and that's what the brain developed throughout evolution, knowing that if something is important, it's going to get maybe signals from neuromodulatory systems to say, you have to remember this in the future. And that's one way that the brain and the physiology does it. It's with this activation of neuromodulatory systems. So this is very good for learning consolidation. You see that somebody is sleeping there. For memory consolidation, sleeping is critical because there is a lot of replay. And then recall goes on the negative side. And there are a lot of studies, and this is, I think, relevant for the exams, that show that if you have high levels before you have to remember something that maybe you acquired before, particularly if it's semantic information, you will have more difficulties. Does it make sense? Yes, you say it makes sense. It makes sense because we know that the stress response, if we are stressed, is there maybe to run, no? If there is a danger or whatever. So if we are stressed, our brain is in a mode of being preoccupied and worried with other things, not with remembering something maybe trivial, which might be my talks or something like that, you see? So that's why it makes sense, and it's important. I think once we know this, we should make sure that we sleep before the exam and also that we are not too stressed. Something I think that's also useful to know is that stress changes brain systems in the functioning. So as I told you before, when we are not much stressed, we are more maybe in the goal-directed behavior. Oh, this is what I want. I'm interested about this. We can maybe make some philosophy, reflection, etc. Under stress, we cannot afford it to have all this, and there is a shift between the brain systems towards more stimulus response type of systems, more mechanistic, more habitual behavior. And that's something important because maybe you heard that there are legal cases in which people forget their kids in the cars sometimes and they die, and afterwards they go to court. And many times now they are using as excuse and as reason that they were under very high stress, and that's why they did something habitual. They normally didn't take the kid. That day it was unusual that they took the kid, and because they were in the habitual, because of stress, in the habitual mode, then they forgot the baby. So let's conclude a bit from this part and also add some other insights from the literature. Acute stress has this inverted U-shape effect in learning. High stress levels impair retrieval, as we said, but also working memory. Hey, it's not good when we try to come up with new theories, and executive function. And also chronic stress tends to impair cognitive function while facilitating habitual and also emotional behavior. Quickly, how does stress make all this? I'm not going to give you a lecture now, but maybe some of you are interested what changes in the brain and why. So we go back to what we saw before, and we have these systems. Adrenaline and all these sympathetic nervous systems, they are very good to react, but they have more trouble to influence back the brain. However, glucocorticoids, these are lipophilic hormones that cross barriers very easily, so they can go into the brain from the peripheral system, from the adrenal glands, go into the bloodstream, and then they can get into the brain. And we see here two images of the brain. On the left side, we see a case of binding of the glucocorticoids to receptors in the brain when the levels are low. You can see that it's mainly the blue and the yellow part. It's the high density of binding. And this is mainly the hippocampus, which is important for learning and memory. And when the levels are very high, you see that it's almost all over. So we have receptors for these stress hormones in the brain that get flooded when we are under high stress. And these receptors, when they are activated, we have here a kind of a cell signaling. And what they can do is to activate or to affect neural functioning immediately, but particularly they are affecting transcription of genes. And many of these genes are going to be very important for memory formation, others for other things. So they are affecting the person that we are going to be tomorrow, if you want. And that's why they can be good for memory consolidation. I pass this. Now, a bit about chronic stress. Chronic stress is something that's going to remodel our brain in ways that are maybe quite intuitive, in fact. So something that's going to affect is some of the characteristics of the structure of neurons. So some neurons that are going to be the units of brain communication are going to be affected in their pieces or parts of contact. I am aware that many of you are not neuroscientists, so you have the synapses, and then there are pruning, there are changes there. Something that is quite interesting is that the brain mainly works with combinations and balance between excitation and inhibition, and that's very important that it's well balanced. And many types of stress, acute and chronic, have been shown to shift the balance towards more excitation. And then one can find also molecules that are involved in maintaining this balance between excitation and inhibition. One way to look at these changes is to think those times when we are stressed and our mind is bombarding us, cannot stop. And this, we know that it's very much related to too much excitation, little inhibition. And you can take, for example, anxiolytics that are going to affect the inhibition pathways, the GABAergic pathways, and get a little bit balanced. But of course, anxiolytics have problems. It's not that I'm proposing that you do this, but this is to show that this is involved. And something else that happens when we are under chronic stress is these changes and this balance between brain regions. As you can see, prefrontal cortex, which is more executive, the neurons get retracted. There is a kind of a reduction in their connectivity, and amygdala, which is important for emotionality and fear, gets affected in the opposite way. The neurons get hypertrophied. And if we look at this other scheme, under chronic stress, there is a negative impact on the prefrontal cortex circuits, so that everything related to action, thought, planning, etc., gets a bit disbalanced towards more emotionality. And to finish this part on the why we don't want to have chronic stress, of course, I've been focusing on the brain, but there are many other systems that get also activated, as we were discussing at the beginning. Cardiovascular system, with the heart beating and the pumping of blood everywhere, metabolic, the immune system. And this is something that it's good and adaptive when it's acute, but when it's chronic, it can lead to a hypertension, cardiovascular disease, obesity, ulcers, depression, and then when it gets sustained for longer, then it can be really problematic and induce many diseases. Another problem with the stress, we have it there, is that we start not doing the right things, and we do a lot of health risky behaviors like overeating, physical activity, inactivity, substance use, sleep deprivation, etc. So just a second to say, is this something that we should all be worried about, or maybe it's not relevant for me? Indeed, we are many, and stress is all over, but we are also reacting in different ways to stress. Are there individuals that are more vulnerable? Of course, one can be more vulnerable because of genetics, early life experiences, because of current life situations, but something that we find in the lab repeatedly and also in the literature is that it depends a lot also on your personality. And then we have personality that can be measured, but one of the important factors is anxiety. Are you aware of what's anxiety? So anxious individuals are those that are always worrying about the future, and that the ones that are not anxious, they are bold, they say, I don't care, etc. So we all can do questionnaires or tests and then be distributed according to this Gaussian and be in the high level or in the low level for being anxious. And this is going to determine very much how we react to stress. For example, in experiments in the lab, we found that those that are more anxious, when they are stressed, they get less self-confident. So it's important to be aware of this, I think. And also, situations that require effort for individuals that tend to be a bit more anxious, then they are more affected. It's like if they get exhausted quicker. Anxiety comes with more fatigue, more physical, mental fatigue. We have, it's not opinion here, we have measures of this. They have less resistance, and also they do more avoidance, less active coping, and they have more troubles to persevere. In fact, being highly anxious gives you vulnerability under stress to develop depression, higher than the others. And also when you are very, very highly anxious, then you are also more comorbid with depression. So how to cope with stress? A couple of things only. One, I think it's very important to look at the science and leverage the science. Maybe sometimes in the biomedical field, we get remarks that we didn't come up with a lot of drugs or treatments because it's very complex. If you think how complex is the brain, how complex are all these processes, I think it's no wonder. But something that I think is important is already to understand how we are, why we are like this, and what affects what. I think it's already key. And something that demonstrates that this can be helpful for some people is this study that was published a couple of months ago. In the US, they did an intervention in adolescents. And they gave, this is a self-administered online training module, in which they gave them two types of manipulations. And having the two is important. And they call it mindsets. One of them is to tell and explain people that during life, we can still grow. Our intellect can develop, so intelligence can be developed. This is one mindset. And the other one is that stress can facilitate it. As I explained to you, stress can be good. Don't just panic because you are stressed. You can grow, you learn, it can help you in many situations. Don't panic. And these manipulations through this app gave incredible results. They did 6 experiments in which they showed that it had good effects in stress-related cognitions, cardiovascular reactivity, daily cortisol levels, psychological well-being, academic success, and anxiety during COVID. So I think this shows the importance. I skipped this. In our lab, to tell you a bit of what we do many studies in rodents, but also try to use neurotechnologies like VR and also other neurotechnologies related more to understanding brain metabolism to understand better stress reactions and also to develop treatments. And then what to do if you are stressed. Everybody talks about the same these days for everything, for mental health, etc. I think what is important, because there are no programs or many programs that have been validated with evidence-based, but many of the aspects of these programs have been validated. And this is the American Psychological Association. You can see there the general themes that they recommend. I like a lot the first one, try to eliminate the stressors, because it requires less energy if you manage to do that. But I think there are very good ideas all over here. And the other recommendation that I would have for you is that stress makes sense in the light of evolution. Don't feel bad. I think understanding ourselves is very important, and understanding your mismatch. Stress was very useful there, and it might be sometimes for us if we have to run, indeed. But we are many times sitting, understand your mismatch so that the stress reaction that you do is really in agreement and alignment to what we need. I thank you very much. We are all different in front of stress, and I hope that from this talk you will be jumping. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now have time for questions. For people who are listening to us online, you can also send us your questions on the chat. And we'll start with questions now in the audience.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I have 2 questions actually. One is about the trait anxiety that you mentioned as part of our personality. Maybe you're not exactly, this is not in your domain of expertise, but if you have any idea of how fixed this is in our personality and how flexible it is, or how much can be affected over the course of our lifetimes by changing, I don't know, our habits or
yes,
the way we approach. And my other question is about, you talked about the effect of stress on learning and on maybe a memory retainment. What about the effect of stress on cognitive performance? For example, if you have to do some analysis on some inputs and give some outputs, do you have any idea about whether or not the stress can be helpful there, or is it completely detrimental? Yeah, those are more 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I need a microphone now because we only have one. Thank you for very interesting questions. So the anxiety one, the work that have been measuring anxiety at different times throughout life in populations have seen that normally the differences keep more or less constant between individuals, even though maybe the actual levels can change. So it's true that there might be fluctuations due to whatever, but it's quite a constant one. One reason is that now that we have better genetic studies, indeed we see that there is a lot of genetic variants or variants that are explained by genetics. Not everything, still it's low. Of course, early life, all the wiring, etc. Still, I have to say that indeed all the experiences can affect us. We can learn about things, we learn strategies, and so on and so forth. Being high anxious is not bad at all. Maybe I went through quickly and I didn't have time to explain this, because when there is not high levels of stress, the high anxious individuals tend to perform better because they are more concerned and worried about the outcome, so they put maybe more effort, they are more conscientious, etc. And in all the experiments that we've done, normally normal anxiety, that you don't go to highly, highly pathological, we don't see a detriment. Sometimes, indeed, they are even a bit better, even animals, etc. It's stress that brings like a big challenge to high anxious individuals that can change things acutely. Finally, afterwards, they can win out with time, etc. So I think for high anxious individuals, it's important to know themselves, accept it, because we are all different, it's wonderful. And then, indeed, to prepare in case, to know how not to be exposed to very high levels, but also just to understand everything. And regarding the stress and cognitive functioning, I don't have amazingly good news for you there, because for indeed working memory and manipulating information in a more creative way that has high cognitive demands, stress is not very good. It's better to be creative. Indeed, we all know that there is this inverted U shape. We are all different, etc. But it's not a process that you can stretch out a lot normally. Yes, I think maybe other ways of modulating this component, like, for example, enjoying the pleasure of the cognitive creativity or something maybe more positive could be more useful there. Yeah.
Any other question?
Thank you for your talk. So you mentioned that people with high anxiety, when they have stress, it comes with, chronic stress comes with disorders and has negative effects on health. But so what about individuals with very low anxiety? If they have a lack of stress, wouldn't there be some sort of depression as well, lack of stimulation, bored out, basically?
What did you say at the end?
Bored out. Just being...
Bored out. Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting question as well. We know much less about individuals with very low anxiety because of the nature. Normally, people have been focusing on those that have high anxiety, depression, etc. But of course, in the lab, we characterize individuals indeed for anxiety, and then we see how they react. And indeed, I think it goes very much with how they can interact with the stress. This is normally individuals that would need higher levels of stress to function, and that's why, indeed, if the system is very low in stress, it could be bored down. That I completely agree. It's, I think, interesting when one is doing experiments, and for example, in animals, you can measure the level of neurotransmitters depending on the anxiety of the individuals, and that gets activated depending on the stress. And there we could see that indeed those low in anxiety had less glucocorticoids coming, and then this is also linked to the levels of glutamate, which is important to activate the neural systems. So we interpret this as a lack of meaning somehow, because they would need more stress. Yeah, I think it's a very important point to understand the whole range of diversity. Yeah.
We do have some. We have some online questions. Are you familiar with studies linking long COVID and high stress levels?
Yeah. No, I think I'm not so worried, but there are so many studies now in long COVID and fatigue, and also I think it's very stressful for people because they don't see the future. So uncertainty is a very strong stressor in general. So I think, yeah, this is something where we would like to do some studies also.
Thank you. And someone is also asking, in case of general anxiety disorder, how can we motivate the person?
Motivate?
How can we help her, I guess, out of where she's stuck?
Yeah, I think there is a big crisis of motivation in general, not only for people with general anxiety disorders. For many different reasons, chronic stress can lead to despair as well, which is also comes with motivation problems. So I think here we have to be aware that there are different components. One is the biology, that sometimes we think everything is psychological, and it's not, unfortunately, for some people. Sometimes people have a virus, and then they have problems, and other times they might have a dysfunction in some system, etc. Of course, behavioral changes change also biology. So it's not that one has to say, oh, biology is deterministic. It's not, because I think that's why my response is abrogated, that we need much more research, because we need to understand much better what changes also that we can tackle. Like, for example, we are very interested in the lab in metabolism, because it's very much dysfunctioned under stress, also mental health problems. And metabolism, we can tackle it with nutritional interventions, for example. So now I got maybe to the more psychological response, but many times we need to have the good milieu in the brain and in the body in order to be able to change. And many times indeed high anxiety and depression comes with high levels of inflammation, which are very, very disturbing for the brain functioning. So I think understanding the physiology is very important, and calming it. If we have really a crisis, which is a more motivational crisis, I think we need to understand the individual, because there is no magical formula that works for everyone. No, there is. Now I became very interested in the topic of motivation in humans and the goal-directed component. What motivates us, not only whether we have the energy, but what motivates us. And then reading, I'm sure that many of you are aware of the Ikigai, for example, concept from, no? Are you aware of Ikigai from Japan, from the Okinawa island, where they try to understand what is maybe the motif, the life motif of, or something that the individual is good and likes to do. It's difficult sometimes to find. And then also whether this is something that's needed, etc. So I think we cannot say, oh, the person should listen to music or play an instrument, because maybe that has nothing to do with this, but trying to really understand what is essential for this person. So I think there is no magical formula. I think it's a very existentialist question also, to say somebody why you should be motivated in life. I think maybe having the pleasure of living is a good answer or for somebody, but it might not be for everyone, depending on the circumstances. So I wouldn't have the magical formula now. Yes.
Thank you. Someone is asking if you could, is it possible to put back the slides with the solutions, well, the solutions with the tips, so people
This
can
one.
have more time.
Yeah.
Thank you. And someone else is asking if there is any evidence on the influence of will, consciousness, selection, or choosing voluntarily stress situation to accomplish goals or challenging tasks. Shall I repeat? Or? Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Evidence, I think this goes back to what I've been discussing, that we are very different, and some people might have indeed a very low stress reactivity, anxiety, and they need to boost these systems in order to be ready for the rest. I think, eventually it's going to be very personal. It's the time also in biomedicine of personalized medicine, personalized psychiatry, and I think for neuroscience or psychiatric neuroscience is a very good time, because we need to put all these elements together. We have to understand the individual, and that's, I think, the challenge. But one can give generalities, no? Afterwards, you have to feel where you are.
Thank you. Is there any other questions?
Okay. Thank you for the talk. It was very useful. I related with some of the things, although I'm not a medicine student. So my question was, so many times you talked about fight and flight. So stress coming from work and stress coming from emotional experience. So for me, when I'm having stress because of emotional experience, I tend to fight. And when I'm having stress from work, it's more of fights. And actually, stress from work kind of helps to kind of fight the stress coming from emotional experience. So how should I adjust that in order to be productive and have good work-life balance also?
I'm not sure I understood perfectly. So you want to use your fight response to be more productive at work?
Yeah. So I don't want to avoid the emotional experiences I'm having with stress. I want to fight on that too.
At the personal level. Eh?
Yeah. But yeah, it just overlaps both of them, and work stress motivates, but the personal stress doesn't motivate.
When you cry, it's a way of giving up somehow. It's like you feel a bit defeated somehow. So I think it's very important to see your way out at all the levels, to be able, either if it's something that it's not good for you and you cannot change, then you have to try to avoid it. But if it's something that you can change, then you have to maybe change your expectations for goals, or you see. Yeah, I think expectations is very important, because that's where we put our measure of our performance, and then that's where we feel either rewarded by our performance or we feel defeated. So I think it's very important to be able to manage expectations of where you want to get and where you can get. And when you get, remember to be happy also.
Can take a last question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question regarding the microbiome in the stress field. I heard about the studies when they put some microbiome samples to mice from different personalities, and then it somehow affected. What are your thoughts about the connection? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a wonderful new venue in biology, because indeed the microbiome is now recognized as having a huge impact on brain functioning at many different levels. The complexity is amazing, because there are so many different strains, combinations, and also host microbiome interactions, etc. But there is a lot of evidence indeed in which just manipulating the microbiome changes behaviors to extremes, like, for example, making animals from autistic-like to normal and sociable, and then affecting also memory and many different domains. The thing is that indeed, because it's the interaction between the microbiome and the individual, so that means we have different genomes. The microbiome that could be maybe good and positive for some individuals might not be so much for others, for many different reasons. I can tell you that there are many different neurotransmitters that interact with that, from the serotonin system to histamine system, etc. And depending on our own genes regarding the processing of all these systems, then we are going to be maybe more prone to be affected by one or the other microbiome, etc. So again, it's very, very difficult, but it's a fascinating new venue. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for this fascinating, really fascinating information. So that's the end of the conference for today. We hear that there is not one way to take care of oneself and to look for that balance, but at least each of you can find among these solutions a personal way to keep the balance and keep the pace with your studies. Have a good day.
Thank you.